Welcome to HeroInside the Ingredient Branding Podcast with Tomas Vucurevic. In each episode, Tomas will draw from his vast experience as the go-to global ingredient branding expert and will discuss this subject with visionaries and pioneers in the field. How do you go from the zero position as a supplier of a new ingredient to the hero position in demand around the world? Let's find out. Welcome back, Tomas. Thank you so much for taking all this time throughout the life of your podcast to share your insights with us. And this is kind of exciting because we first spoke for the initial launch episode of HeroInside Podcast. And now we're several years on. You've helped so many people. You've had so many interesting interviews. And it's nice for us to sort of go back over it together and think back on what you've learned over the past few years. So maybe the first question is, what does it feel like to look back on the journey of your podcast career so far?
Oh, it's amazing. I think I was a bit scared to start it in the first place, and it was also people like you who helped me to jump over that quite hurdle to start a podcast. But now, after 3 seasons, I have to say it became a central element of our branding and marketing and communication for Brand and for the HeroInside podcast. So it feels great.
So before we go into depth, I wanted to ask something more general. In terms of your experience making this podcast, you're the expert who invited CEOs of companies that have ingredients that they are branding to come and share their experience with you. But what did you learn over the process of hosting this podcast?
I would say 2 things really that now come to my mind. One is that I really learned a lot myself. I was thinking I know a lot about ingredient branding and my guests will share their knowledge, but there were really a lot of moments where people framed certain experiences in a way that I hadn't thought about it before. And then also this collective experience out of these many conversations created an entire pool of new knowledge for us and gave direction also for our consulting business in the upcoming years, because we later talk about also how the ingredient brand landscape has changed. I think the other element that's important is in a podcast, you have to be a very good listener. And when I look back at editing our podcast episodes after we recorded them, it was mainly my own parts that we cut out because you have then the tendency to reply to the answers of the guests. And sometimes it became too long, it became too much of my own talking. So I think what I learned is, to really listen, to focus on guiding the conversation in a certain way, to bring it into the right context, react also to what has been said. And I think it's also, I don't know if it's unusual, but for me, I didn't expect that all episodes so far we recorded in one take, and they developed in good conversations with a similar pattern. There is a certain nervousness in the first few minutes until you really get into this flow of a conversation, also like in this episode. So I think these are the main learnings from 2.5 years of HeroInside Podcast.
It occurs to me that with each interview that you give, you're going to learn information about that particular person and case study. But when you look at 2+ seasons, you're going to see some things that are consistent across multiple interviews. And can you think of anything that stood out to you, that many different interviews as touchstones that you can then say, okay, if 70% of the interview subjects said the same sort of thing. I'll give you an example. There was a period where I was interviewing famous writers about their writing habits, and I would ask them the same set of questions, and almost all of them said that a good writing day was writing 1,000 usable words. And once I had so many people at the top of the profession saying the same thing, you get to say, okay, that must be the mark of a successful writing day. Anything like that across your experience?
Yes, and I think it's a confirmation also from my own work previously as a brand manager of a well-known ingredient brand. But I would say the one thing that everybody confirmed in those conversations is that this journey from zero to hero is a long game. It took them years, decades, lifetime sometimes. So everyone of the listeners who thinks, ingredient branding is a short-term marketing activity, let's design a nice hang tag or label and stick it onto the products of our customers, have realized out of those conversations that it takes an enormous effort. Some people said, if they would have known at the beginning what it would be like, they probably wouldn't have started it at all. But then also confirmed that it's going to pay off, right? And if we take a case like ECONYL, where Giulia Bonazzi, who was the first guest in the podcast, and their production site is just a few 100 meters away here from our office where we are recording, started this whole journey in 2012 with that first plant that they created here in Ljubljana with 13,000 tons of capacity. And I think now they have reached 60,000 tons. They are aiming to have all of their materials made of ECONYL in the future. So it really shows that if you stick to it, if you believe in it, if you have the passion and also the determination to pull it through, it pays off. But it's a long journey.
That's interesting. Okay, and that it's been consistently so over all the people that you've interviewed. That's good to know. So you've always been committed to sharing knowledge with the community, and that's also what led you to create BRAINDERY, which is an educational branch for those generally interested in ingredient branding. Can you just briefly explain what BRAINDERY is and how that got started for people unfamiliar with it?
Yeah, the BRAINDERY is kind of our education platform. So at Brain, we are doing strategic brand consulting for ingredient brands. So usually we run projects for companies that last sometimes, or at least 4 to 6 months, many of them 9 to 12 months. And then often after the consulting project is over, we are going in some kind of retainer agreement where we are staying on board with the clients in something that we could call a brand steering committee, or it's kind of an advisory role where we are supporting the clients with the implementation, which is the hardest thing. We will talk about that later. While with the BRAINDERY and coming to a certain age, also to a certain point of time in my career, where I had the feeling it's needed to share experience, knowledge, wisdom from my 25 years in ingredient branding, but also from my clients and also other guests at the podcast with the next generation. And we have been working with startups, but we have also been approached by many founders, students, people who are writing their thesis on ingredient branding or are in other form interested in the topic. And I had the feeling there we also need a platform beyond consulting where we can share this experience and knowledge. And that's why we started the masterclass 3 or 4 years ago, and we had some first startups going through that masterclass who also now are on their way to become successful ingredient brands. And the podcast is another format where we are sharing this, and it's for free. Now it's also advertising free. So we also hope and rely on the community to share that content with others. So we are getting more exposure because I think the content is really valuable for anyone who is thinking about applying the ingredient brand model on their business.
So it's very generous of you, really, because so many companies come to you because you are the go-to person specializing in this. But then you want to open it up to others to make sure that the knowledge that you've gathered over career is available. And so the masterclass is one option for people who want to go in depth. The podcast is a great point of entry. And it's sometimes hard to choose where to start with the podcast. Of course, there are many episodes so far. You can choose based on the brand or the person being interviewed. I think ideally, if you listen to it all the way through, you're essentially getting a sort of masterclass just by virtue of the fact of having your wisdom and reaction to the people you interviewed and the personal stories of these successful, in most cases, CEOs. You mentioned Giulio Bonazzi and ECONYL. Could you maybe mention one or two other key appearances? It's hard to choose any favorites, of course, but what comes to mind at the moment that you might highlight for people if they're thinking, okay, I'd like to try this out, but what are the first couple of episodes I should listen to?
Well, I think it's unfair to judge any of the episodes we've done so far in terms of, oh, this was better than that one, or that was really special. I think I would look at it more from the perspective, in which position am I as a listener? Am I a founder? Am I a startup that is already in a certain phase of commercialization? Or am I more a corporate guy who is a manager, a hired manager in an organization? Then you could select, for example, by that. Right? So if you're in a management position in a corporate company, you would probably go more to podcast episodes like Once More by Södra or Polygene or Gore-Tex, where I'm speaking with management people who are in charge of a role. If you're a founder, we have episodes with founders like Michael Eid for Leap or Fidlock, which is an amazing founder story where a cello player solved a personal problem to transport his cello on the bicycle, and out of that developed an amazing portfolio of products. Or if it's about endurance and understanding really the dynamics of a long-term effect, is an episode of RECCO and the foundation of the company based on a personal tragedy, being part of an avalanche situation. And then out of that personal experience, create a company and create a whole ecosystem. So these are all really impressive stories. And honestly, sometimes I would say competitors, even though I don't think we really have a competition in the sense of ingredient brand consulting, but other agencies are asking me, why do you give away so much content for free? Is that not jeopardizing your business? But I never felt like that. And I think there is more left within me and within Brain out of the experiences of, on one side, working for one top ingredient brand in a responsible management function for 10 years. So knowing how to do it and having the proof of concept that I did it myself. And then the breadth of 50, 60, 70 other ingredient brands that we looked in detail into it, and combining all of that knowledge and experience that remains absolutely unique, even if you share certain elements of that. It's like a puzzle, we are giving away parts of the puzzle, but if you don't know the full picture, it's going to be a hard time to put together the puzzle in the right way. So I'm not really concerned of oversharing knowledge or experiences with the community, but rather happy to see more people applying the ingredient brand model on in their businesses.
So you already mentioned that one of the consistent things that you found is that this is a long game, that so many of the CEOs said that it's not an overnight success, it's not short term, but you have to look long term. Over the course of all of these interviews you've done, are there any other common patterns that you see besides that long game approach?
Yeah, we will maybe also still talk about it, what has changed in recent years, but I would say what is becoming more and more evident through certain developments that are related to sustainability, that are related to the urgently needed what's called next-gen materials. So let's say biodegradable, circular materials that are going to replace incumbents that have been around for 70, 80 years. And a lot of ingredient branding is based on innovation from the chemical industry, where the products might have been absolutely revolutionary, delivering unknown performances and adding a lot of value to products. If you take the example of Lycra, that has completely changed the way garments are made. But on the other side, now elastan is becoming also an obstacle for recycling, for separating it from the materials it's combined with. In circularity and sustainability, a lot is going back to mono materials, because everything you put together in a composite or in a fabric or a fiber is difficult to take apart. So a lot of it is going into mono materials and different ways of implementing eco design. So that is changing also the way you look at ingredient branding. I would say in the past, and also maybe in the beginning of this podcast, we look more at the material itself, the innovation in the material. What have you done? What are the performances of your materials? What benefit you can bring? What promise can you develop out of it and give to the consumers or to the value chain? But now it's really shifting into how do I successfully integrate that into existing supply chains? Because there is a massive inertia in existing supply chains against change. Replacing materials industries have worked with for 30, 50, 70 or 100 years, changing the way products are made. And if you are now coming in with a new material and you are not able to drop that into the existing supply chains, and you need to build new supply chains, and you need to build the business models, the commercial models behind, that is, I would say, the biggest learning of some of the last episodes, where we are also focusing more on these next-gen materials.
That's very interesting. Yeah, it's one thing to come up with a new invention, but it's another thing to make sure that it's logistically feasible without a huge additional investment, that it fits in with what's pre-existing as well as possible. So you are the go-to guru of this subject. You probably don't like the term guru, but that's how people tend to think of you when it comes to ingredient branding. And when the guests come to your podcasts, most of them are people that have already worked with you in some capacity. But were there any guests who sort of pushed back a little bit or challenged your way of thinking in a positive, critical way, or in a way that made you think differently after your interaction with them?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think just one of the very recent episode with Henri Kunz, for example, when he brought some complete new thoughts around how supply chains move, why do they engage with raw materials. He, for example, demystified a little bit this wish of many founders, for example, to work with the luxury industry. That's something every material innovator dreams of. How can I get my new material into the luxury industry? It's partly also true for the automotive industry, where you have very, very strong brands, and you believe, if I can get into those brands, then I'm going to make it. That's my tipping point. After that, everybody else will come to me once I work with Mercedes or Porsche or Louis Vuitton or Hermes or Dior. But understanding in some of those podcasts how those maisons or fashion houses or luxury brands actually view materials, it is not in the most friendliest way. So I think a phrase that was used is that, they want to own the narrative, but they don't want to take over the responsibility. So they're pushing down all the responsibility on the material, on the functionality, on you as a supplier. They don't want your brand to be known as an ingredient brand, but they want to steal or use the narrative and to weave it into their own brand story. And that's a general, I think, push many founders or startups are experiencing, that the strong brands are using their power to search, for example, for exclusivity. Now everybody wants to make exclusive agreements for many years so that they get this material exclusively, which is a result of the situation that many brands in general don't have any more big R&D departments, so they are reducing their own investments in research and development and product development. And we had also one podcast where the guests were talking about that they are taking over that role as an outsourced R&D department almost. And that is, again, very good to improve the resilience of your position. So you're not just a supplier, but you're a product development guy. So many new aspects came up in these conversations. And again, I can invite everyone to listen to. There is also new ways of how you can extract content, through AI and other things. So people, I think, can make valuable usage of the audios that we've provided.
Absolutely. We talked about some of the insights that you got from your guests, but what about feedback from the audience? Did anyone tell you anything about how your podcast led them to think differently about how they might approach their own business models, for example?
Oh yes, absolutely. I think a common thread amongst people who start to think about ingredient branding is that they look at it as a marketing activity, or even worse, a marketing communications activity. So we've seen a lot of companies going to trade shows, having a product that they want to sell, then they create a label with their name on it, and they expose themselves at this show and saying, okay, we are an ingredient brand. But they don't really actually know and understand what that means. Mm-hmm. And I think that feedback we've got from a lot of listeners is saying, okay, through listening through the podcast, through listening through these entrepreneurs who build their companies based on the ingredient brand model, we much more understood that this is a go-to-market model. It's a business model that you choose that is shaping your entire organization. And it also needs to be brought to life by the entire organization. So ingredient branding is nothing that can be owned or should be located in the marketing department. Mm-hmm. It is a business decision, and then all parts of the business need to understand what does it mean to apply ingredient branding in R&D, in product development, in sales, in marketing, in finance. We also had feedback from financial people who understand more how they are creating an intangible asset over time, how the ingredient brand helps them to be more resilient in their role of the supplier. Because we still do a lot of ingredient branding projects, let's say, in the wider space of fabrics, fibers, textiles, some kind of raw materials that go into industries that don't have very strong business contracts. Just consider how the financial community is evaluating the value of your company, usually by a multiple of EBITDA. And if you are a supplier, let's say to the aerospace industry, you're a supplier into a new Airbus plane, you probably have a contract over 15 years. So if you don't do any major mistakes, you're going to supply that material for 15 years or for the lifetime of that plane into this plane. So then an investor would evaluate your company much higher, with a much higher multiple than, for example, in the textile industry, where you literally have no deals or contracts at all. So brands like, or retailers like Zara, H&M, or brands like Adidas or Lululemon or whoever, they are buying their raw materials daily without any long-term agreements. So that means the quality of your business is quite low. And that means you can be exchanged as a supplier anytime, right? And then who wants to own such a company, or who wants to invest in such a company? While if you build a brand, an ingredient brand, then it's much more difficult to be replaced, because they're not only replacing your material, but they're replacing your ingredient brand, and maybe that will generate an impact by retailers or consumers or other media if your ingredient brand all of a sudden is not anymore embedded in those products. So it's really something to improve your business stability.
It sounds like it's really one of the foundational elements, whereas people tend to think of it too often as something you do after the fact. Okay. Since the first episode, now nearly 3 years ago, and especially with the rise of things like sustainability, new innovative materials, and shifting value chains, I was about to ask, how has the situation changed and evolved since the first episode? So basically, what have you seen over the last 3 years that shows an evolution that people interested in this field should be aware of?
Oh, we've seen a massive change, and particularly in the field of what is called sustainability. And it had already started, but I think it's clear since the election in the US and the new government taking over, that the topic of sustainability has suffered. There is this big bag of wokeness, that has been tried to push back, and climate change, is it real, is it not real, and all of those things have created an environment where the companies immediately felt, there is less pressure. So that was leading to many companies postponing their climate targets, postponing their sustainability efforts, or reducing them, because they immediately felt, the financial market is making less pressure, the legal frameworks have been loosened, certain things have been postponed, and that is leading into something that we could call a sustainability recession, or just the fact that the topic lost a lot of attention. And by that, companies immediately try to get out of it, because more sustainability means higher costs, potentially buying more expensive raw materials again to replace other materials. So that is a massive change. And I think in the beginning, and I also created this model of the 3 generation of ingredient brands. So a few years ago, we were clearly saying, there's this first generation performance-based ingredient brands that make products better. Then we said, since 10, 15 years, we saw the rise of the second generation ingredient brands that were around helping companies to reach their sustainability goals by helping them to lower their emissions, having more recycled content, adding circularity to it. And we established that as a second generation ingredient brands that helped companies to be better. And there was just on the horizon something coming up, what we already described as the third generation, which was more the regenerative character. And we had some brands here with certain fiber types like hemp, but also a brand like Ulex that is replacing neoprene, again, petrochemical-based product with natural rubber, but that rubber is also coming from small farms in Vietnam, helping to build community there. So it was not only the circularity of the material, but it's also about restoring, because the word, sustainability embeds the word sustain. And if you look at where we are at the moment with everything's going on in the world, I think we don't want to sustain that status, but we want to regenerate it. So this movement from sustainability toward regeneration, going down with the warming of the planet, going down with pollution and other impacts on the environment and also species, with discarding fish nets and what if all of that is doing, that has been pushed back, and the companies are immediately taking advantage of that. So we said a few years ago, if you bring in a sustainable material to replace something less sustainable, it needs to perform at least as good as the incumbent. Yeah. But the market was also willing to accept even lower performance. And I think now we're in the situation where you almost need to better perform. So it's not only that you are kind of equally performing, but you need to convince the brands but maybe also the consumers that this new material is also better, back to generation 1. Okay. And that's a massive change.
So generation 3, a good example is Ulex. For people who are unfamiliar with the generational model, can you just give one example of generation 1 and one example of generation 2, just so they can put it into context?
Yes, I mean, generation 1 is what I also referred in my model, and you can read about that on the Brained website in our knowledge section, and we published quite a lot about that. Also some articles and white papers, for example, in the Houston magazine. Yeah, generation 1 is what we also call the DuPont model, and nylon was probably the first ingredient brand of that first generation, helping customers to make better products. But maybe Gore-Tex and Vibram, some of those brands are Lycra representatives of that first generation. I think the second generation, we already talked about it. For me, it's really ECONYL is a master example of this second generation. So a product that's chemically and technically doing exactly the same as virgin nylon, but it's made from waste, discarded fish nets and other waste. But it's really the narrative that is nurturing the brands who are working with and showing very impressively that you can work with many brands. So they work with Prada, they work with Burberry, they work with various car brands. Simultaneously, there is no need for exclusivity if you really want to change consumer behavior. And as you mentioned, Ulex is probably at the moment at the forefront of this third generation, where we would like to see much more happening, but where also the inventors are getting pushed back because of the changed economics and the changed environment or business environment that we see in the last 2-3 years. Also, some people describe that as the petro-nostalgica, unfortunately.
Okay. We have to keep in mind that while it sounds good objectively as a consumer that all these brands should be doing as much as possible for the environment, they have to also follow the bottom line. And if there isn't external pressure or sometimes support from governments to do so, then they may be delaying things for financial reasons. We talked about the last few generations and the last few years, what changes you've seen. If you're going to put on your prediction hat and imagine 5 years from now, what do you expect to see in this sector? Is it more about delaying the fulfillment of Generation 3 regenerative, or do you expect to see something entirely new?
Well, I think with this polycrisis that we are facing and that has accelerated through these situations that we are having now, wars which we could have not imagined that they would happen, the impact this has on the economy, the sensitivity of the governments to immediately react on economical problems, loosening those sustainability goals or other initiatives, be it social or whatever. As you know, one of the Americans said, it's the economy, stupid. I don't know who said it. I think it was related to Clinton in one way. You maybe know, but clearly these changes that we have now seen, turning the wheels back and getting the economy running, will not go away in a year or two. So I predict that we are back in a phase for inventors, innovators, startups to think about performance. I think the pure sustainability or regenerative narrative is currently losing its attractiveness. It needs to be combined with performance. As I said, ideally, you are saying, our ingredient helps you to make better products again, and they're also sustainable. Yeah. And one of these topics where we see some promising results is, for example, this whole debate around forever chemicals. There is legislation around to reduce forever chemicals, or called PFAS. We find them everywhere. They're in our water, they're in our glaciers, in our mountains, they're in our blood. Sometimes they're in our brain. Mm-hmm. So these are chemicals that are staying forever, and they're not getting in nature in any way degraded. Right. And one of the applications of these forever chemicals were performance textiles, very much in the area of also waterproof membranes, and particular also the water repellency, which is very important for many products, be it footwear, tents, uniforms of workers. And here are some new technologies that are very promising. So we are, for example, here also working with a company in the electrospinning area, and they provide new technologies that are PFAS-free, but on top are delivering certain performance elements that are better than the incumbent. And I think this is the future. It also has been confirmed in some of the recent episodes where we are saying, it's also sustainable. But if you go with a pure sustainability or regeneration narrative, at this point of time, how the world has changed in the last 2 to 3 years, it's going to be difficult.
I do want to ask you about the ISPO trade show to finish off. But before we get there, if I can ask for one more that's really a concrete, actionable takeaway for people listening who have a business of their own. So after multiple seasons, is there one piece of advice for someone who wants to build an ingredient brand today? Like the one big takeaway, with the understanding is it's hard to distill that and there are many components, but what's the one big one?
I would repeat what I said before. It's the understanding that the successful commercialization of your ingredient and the really understanding the entire supply chain, being very clear around your commercial model, is as important as the innovation itself. Okay. And I think that is something that has changed also in my viewpoint and also in our consulting work, when we haven't been looking so deeply also into the commercial model. into the business model and in terms of saying, okay, how are you going to mass commercialize, and how do you get to price points that are acceptable by the brand partners, by the retailers, and finally by the consumers, in order to bring your product into the market. And that's often unfair, and in many cases, or some people refer to it as the valley of death. So that's the time between you are able to show a functioning prototype in, let's say, homeopathic volumes of 50 tons or 100 tons, or a certain number of meters that you can give to somebody to make a capsule collection. So you're generating PR and media, and everybody wants to have your ingredient. And then getting to 100,000 tons, or at least 10,000 tons, which would be of a material which would be the start of something like mass custom commercialization. And that brings me back to a phrase I used many, many years ago already in some teaching and speaking opportunities, when I said, innovation and invention are two different things you were mentioning before. So innovation is actually equals invention plus successful commercialization. If you have only an invention and you don't know how to successfully commercialize, it almost has no value anymore. Yeah. And I think that's the number one advice. So in parallel, as you start working on your material, as you start to make tests of all kinds that run for years in order to prove your product concept, you in parallel really need to work extremely hard on your commercial model.
So you should start ingredient branding really as early as possible from the start. It's not an afterthought at all.
Yeah, maybe not even the focus on the brand itself is not so important, but then thinking about the commercial model. Okay. To whom do you want to sell? What's the supply chain setup? Who's going to be my partners? Because you can also not implement an ingredient brand against existing supply chain inertia.
To conclude, I want to thank you. You mentioned learning from masters, and you are the master of this. So it's very generous of you to share your knowledge in the way that you do. You could easily just wait for these big brands to call you up and you do the consulting, and that's the end of it. But you're sharing the knowledge with online material. Visit the Brained website, Braindery, this podcast. Everything you're doing to present it to the wider community is incredibly valuable and very much appreciated. So thank you for that.
Oh, it's a pleasure, and I'm really enjoying it because it at a certain point of your career, I think everybody's also starting to look back and thinks about what legacy has been created and how that knowledge and experience can be shared with the next generation. And I really like to work with those dynamic entrepreneurs who are at the beginning of their journeys, towards building up a strong brand. So it's a pleasure.
Take advantage of all of the excellent material that Tomas has made available to you. Subscribe to the podcast, share it with anyone who you think would be interested, listen to as many episodes as you like, and keep track whenever Tomas does an appearance. This is the person to talk to about ingredient branding, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
To share your insights and questions for this episode, go to our Brained LinkedIn page and join the conversation. The link is included in the show notes. Subscribe to the HeroInside Podcast to make sure you don't miss our upcoming episodes. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep being a hero on your journey to a better world.
This has been an episode of HeroInside, the Ingredient Branding Podcast with Tomas Vucurevic. Each episode features stories and wisdom from game-changing creators and the shapers of the world's most exciting and influential ingredient brands. To learn more about ingredient branding and Tomas's work, visit braind.co. That's BRAIND.co. Until next time,